A three-bedroom house in California once symbolized success. The American dream with a Spanish tile roof and a two-car garage. Today, it's a ticking time bomb. Right now, thousands of Californians are waking up to a reality they didn't see coming. Their greatest asset, the home they stretched to afford, the investment they were told was bulletproof, is unraveling beneath them. In some parts of California, housing listings have surged 400% in just 6 months. Not because the market is thriving, because people are desperate to get out. This isn't a crash that happens overnight. It's a collapse that moves in stages. 7 stages. And by the time you recognize which one you're in, it may already be too late. Over the next 25 minutes, we're going to walk through the 7 levels of California's housing collapse. From the golden age of prosperity to the ghost towns forming in the Central Valley. From the American dream to the American nightmare. Each level represents a stage in the breakdown. Moments where optimism turned concern, concern turned to panic, and panic turned to exodus. By level 7, we'll see how California's housing market doesn't just crash. It fundamentally transforms into something unrecognizable. Some cities may never recover. Here's what makes this story different. These levels aren't theoretical. They're happening right now, in real time, across different parts of the state. Some neighborhoods are still at level 2, riding high on denial. Others have already crossed into level 5, watching their equity vanish in months. So here's my question for you. Which level do you think your city is on? Drop your guess in the comments, because by the end of this video, you'll know exactly what to look for. Let's start at the beginning, when California was still the promised land. Level 1, the golden dream. Picture it, 1995 to 2012. California wasn't just growing, it was exploding. Silicon Valley was minting millionaires. Hollywood was thriving. The ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach were arteries pumping goods into America's economy. Even the Central Valley, farmland and forgotten towns, started to see suburban sprawl creep in, bringing strip malls and new schools and hope. Owning a home in California meant you'd made it. It meant your kids would go to good schools. It meant you were part of the engine driving the entire country forward. The numbers told a beautiful story. From 2000 to 2006, California home prices doubled. In some coastal areas, they tripled. A modest bungalow in San Diego that sold for $280,000 in 2000 was worth $650,000 by 2005. Equity wasn't something you earned. It was something that just happened to you while you slept. And it wasn't just the rich. Teachers, nurses, firefighters. They were buying homes too, stretching with adjustable rate mortgages and interest-only loans, because everyone knew one universal truth. California real estate only goes up. The freeways filled with commuters willing to drive 2 hours each way, because even the distant suburbs felt like winning lottery tickets. Riverside, Stockton, Modesto, these weren't just towns anymore. They were gateways. Places where a middle-class family could still grab a piece of the California dream before it slipped away entirely. There was a rhythm to it, a confidence. You'd see young couples at open houses on Sunday afternoons, their faces bright with possibility, talking about which room would be the nursery. You'd see retirees selling in Los Angeles and buying in Palm Desert, pocketing $500,000 in profit and still ending up with a bigger house. Even after the 2008 financial crisis rattled the nation, California bounced back faster than almost anywhere else. By 2012, the recovery was underway. Tech companies were hiring again. Foreign investors were buying up distressed properties and flipping them. The market healed, and with it, the belief that California was simply different, special, recession-proof in the long run. The golden dream wasn't just about houses. It was about identity. Californians believed they lived in the future, that their state was the blueprint for what the rest of America would eventually become. And for a while, they were right. But every dream, no matter how golden, casts a shadow. And California's shadow was starting to grow. Because beneath all that optimism, something dangerous was building. Something that looked like prosperity, but was actually pressure. And pressure, when it has nowhere to go, doesn't just release slowly. It explodes. Level 2, the overheating. By 2015, the California housing market wasn't just recovering, it was roaring. Tech companies weren't just hiring, they were printing money. Facebook, Google, Apple, Netflix, they were paying software engineers $300,000 a year, plus stock options that could double overnight. A 28-year-old coder fresh out of Stanford could outbid a family of four without blinking. Venture capital was flooding into the Bay Area like a biblical flood. Startups with no revenue were valued at $1 billion. And all those newly minted millionaires needed somewhere to live. So they bought and bought and bought. A single-family home in Palo Alto listed at $2.8 million would get 20 offers in a weekend. Buyers were waiving inspections, offering all cash, bidding $500,000 over asking just to compete. The median home price in San Francisco hit $1.3 million. In San Jose, it crossed $1 million. But here's the thing about overheating. It spreads. The engineers and executives who got priced out of Palo Alto moved to San Jose. The ones priced out of San Jose moved to Fremont. The ones priced out of Fremont moved to Tracy. And on, rippling outward like a shockwave, driving up prices in cities that had always been affordable. By 2019, you couldn't find a single-family home in the entire Bay Area for under $700,000. Not in the good neighborhoods. Not in the bad ones. Not anywhere. And it wasn't just the Bay Area. Los Angeles, San Diego, Orange County. They were all caught in the same fever. Investors from China, Canada, and Wall Street were buying properties sight unseen, paying cash, treating California real estate like a safer bet than the stock market. Meanwhile, interest rates were at historic lows. You could lock in a 30-year mortgage at 3.5%. It felt like free money. So people borrowed. They stretched. They convinced themselves that a $4,500 mortgage payment on a household income of $120,000 was totally sustainable because, hey, the house would be worth $1.5 million in 5 years anyway. The illusion was everywhere. Real estate agents were celebrities. House flipping shows dominated cable TV. Everyone had a cousin or a co-worker who'd made $200,000 flipping a condo in Sacramento. The market stopped being a place where people found homes. It became a casino, a speculation engine. Shelter became secondary to profit. And the warning signs? They were drowned out by the noise of success. Rents were skyrocketing. $3,000 for a one-bedroom apartment in Oakland. Homelessness was surging. Tent cities spreading under freeway overpasses. Teachers and firefighters were being forced to leave the cities they served because they couldn't afford to live there anymore. But those were easy to ignore when your neighbor just sold their house for $400,000 more than they paid 3 years ago. The system was overheating. The demand was artificial. The prices were detached from reality. But nobody wanted to believe it, because the moment you admit the dream is unsustainable, you have to admit you might lose everything you built. And Californians weren't ready for that conversation. Not yet. But the market was about to force it on them anyway, because level 3 was coming. And with it, the first real cracks in the foundation. Few people realize what happened next, because it didn't start with a crash. It started with something quieter. Something most people missed until it was already too late. Level 3, the warning signs. The pandemic had just reshaped America, and California's housing market was doing something nobody expected. It was accelerating. Remote work meant tech employees could live anywhere. So they sold their $1.2 million San Francisco condos and bought sprawling homes in Boise, Austin, Phoenix. Places where that same money bought you 4,000 square feet and a pool. The exodus had begun. But most Californians didn't see it as a warning. They saw it as opportunity. With high earners leaving, surely prices would stabilize, right? Surely housing would become affordable again for the teachers, the nurses, the firefighters who'd been priced out. That's not what happened. Instead, institutional investors swooped in. BlackRock, Invitation Homes, corporate landlords with billions in capital. They started buying single-family homes by the hundreds. In Sacramento, they'd make all-cash offers on entire blocks. In Riverside, they'd close in 7 days. No contingencies. They weren't buying homes. They were buying rental income, passive revenue streams. And they could outbid any family every single time. So prices didn't fall. They plateaued. Then in 2022, something changed. The Federal Reserve started raising interest rates aggressively. By the end of that year, mortgage rates had jumped from 3% to 7%. Suddenly, that $800,000 house had a monthly payment $1,500 higher than it would have had a year earlier. First-time buyers were locked out completely. Even families trading up found themselves trapped. Why would you sell your house with a 2.8% mortgage to buy another one at 7%? The market froze. And that's when the warning signs became impossible to ignore. In San Francisco, office buildings started going vacant. Tech companies were laying off thousands. Google, Meta, Amazon, companies that had driven the entire Bay Area economy, were cutting 10%, 15%, 20% of their workforce. The engineers who'd been paying $4,000 a month for studio apartments suddenly had no income. Landlords started offering 2 months free rent just to fill units. But it wasn't enough. In downtown San Francisco, the commercial vacancy rate hit 30%. Entire blocks looked like ghost towns. Stores were closing. Restaurants were shuttering. The vibrancy that had made the city iconic was evaporating. And it wasn't just San Francisco. In Los Angeles, housing inventories started to creep up. Homes that used to sell in 5 days were sitting on the market for 30, then 60, then 90. Sellers were cutting prices by $50,000, then $100,000. Try to attract buyers who simply weren't there anymore. Here's where it got personal. Meet Sarah and Marcus, a couple in their early 30s. They'd been renting in Oakland for 7 years, saving obsessively, waiting for their chance. In 2022, they finally had enough for a down payment. They found a modest 3-bedroom in a decent neighborhood, listed at $850,000. Their real estate agent was optimistic. Rates are high now, but they'll come down. You'll refinance in 2 years and your payment will drop. So they stretched, they borrowed, they moved in. 18 months later, their home was worth $720,000. They were underwater by $130,000. The refinance their agent promised? Impossible. They were trapped in a house they could barely afford, watching their equity vanish month by month. And Sarah and Marcus weren't unique. They were everywhere. First-time buyers who'd been told this was their last chance to get in before prices went even higher. Families who'd waive inspections and overbid in panic. People who bet their entire financial future on the belief that California real estate always goes up. They were all learning the same brutal lesson. Gravity applies to housing markets too. The data told the story in cold numbers. In San Bernardino County, home prices dropped 8% year over year. In Stockton, 11%. In parts of the Central Valley, listings had tripled while sales had fallen by half. But here's what made Level 3 so insidious. It looked like a correction, not a collapse. It looked temporary. Uncomfortable, yes, but fixable. The real estate agents kept saying it. The news kept repeating it. It's just a soft landing. The market is normalizing. This is healthy. And maybe, for a moment, people wanted to believe that. But the system wasn't normalizing. It was cracking, quietly, invisibly, in 1,000 small ways that wouldn't show up on the headlines until it was far too late. Because while everyone was focused on interest rates and inventory numbers, something deeper was breaking. Trust. Trust that your home would hold its value. Trust that California was still the land of opportunity. Trust that the system rewarded hard work and patience. That trust was the foundation of everything. And once it cracked, there was no putting it back together. The market was about to learn that the hard way. What happened next wasn't a gentle decline. It was a rupture. And the people who saw it coming, they were already planning their escape. Level 4, the cracks form. Late 2023. The cracks weren't subtle anymore. Drive through any suburb in the Inland Empire and you'd see them for sale signs. Not 1 or 2 per block. 5, 8, 12. Streets that used to feel alive. Kids riding bikes. Neighbors chatting on porches. Now fell hollow. The families were leaving. Mortgage defaults started climbing. Not the catastrophic numbers of 2008. Not yet, but enough to notice. In Riverside County, foreclosure filings increased 34% year over year. In San Joaquin County, 41%. These weren't subprime borrowers with predatory loans. These were families with traditional 30-year mortgages who'd simply reached their breaking point. The $4,200 mortgage payment, the $600 monthly HOA fee, the skyrocketing property taxes reassessed at peak values, the car payments, the groceries, the childcare. One by one, they were doing the math and realizing, we can't make this work. So they listed their homes and waited, because nobody was buying. The buyers who would have competed at $850,000 in 2021 weren't approved for loans anymore. Their income looked fine on paper, but debt-to-income ratios killed the deal. The investors who'd paid all cash for years had moved on to cheaper markets in the Sun Belt. Houses sat. Weeks turned into months. Sellers started panicking. That $850,000 list price dropped to $799,000, then $775,000, then $749,000. Some took their homes off the market entirely, hoping to wait it out. Others accepted offers $150,000 below what they'd paid 2 years earlier just to escape. Small towns in the Central Valley started to hollow out. Places like Manteca, Turlock, Merced, these were cities that had boomed during the 2010s as Bay Area workers accepted brutal commutes for affordable housing. Now those workers were gone. Remote jobs had either ended or relocated to other states entirely. The storefronts on Main Street started closing. First the boutique shops, then the chain restaurants. Then even the grocery stores started looking sparse. Picture this, a cul-de-sac in Tracy, 10 homes. In 2021, every driveway had 2 cars, every lawn was maintained, every porch light was on at night. By late 2023, 3 homes had for sale signs. 2 were clearly vacant. Newspapers piling up, weeds overtaking the yard. One had a notice of default taped to the door. The American dream, dead on a suburban street. And it wasn't just the Central Valley. Even in supposedly stable markets, the foundation was crumbling. In Orange County, luxury homes that had once sold in days were sitting for 6 months. A 4-bedroom in Irvine listed at $2.1 million got one lowball offer at $1.7 million. The seller refused. 3 months later, they accepted $1.65 million. San Diego saw its median home price fall 12% from peak to trough. 12% might not sound catastrophic, but on an $850,000 home, that's $102,000 in vanished equity. For families who put 10% down, that meant their entire down payment was gone, and then some. Construction came to a grinding halt. Developers who'd broken ground on massive housing projects in 2022 were now scrambling. With home prices falling and buyer demand collapsing, the math no longer worked. Projects were abandoned mid-construction. Concrete foundations sat empty, exposed to the elements, slowly cracking. In Sacramento, a planned development of 300 homes was halted after only 47 had sold. The developer declared bankruptcy. The homes sat unfinished, windows broken, copper wiring stripped by thieves. The jobs followed the construction. Contractors, electricians, plumbers, they started leaving California for Nevada, Texas, Arizona, states where building was still happening, where there was still work. And then came the ripple effects. Home improvement stores saw sales drop 30%. Real estate agents, there were 500,000 licensed agents in California at the peak, started leaving the industry entirely. Mortgage brokers closed their offices. Title companies laid off staff. Every part of the ecosystem that had fed on California's housing boom was starving. But here's what made Level 4 different from a typical market correction. The psychology had shifted. In a normal downturn, buyers wait for the bottom, then rush back in. Buy the dip, right? Not this time. Because the people who would have been buyers, the millennials, the young families, the first-time homeowners, had been burned. They'd watch their friends buy at the peak and lose everything. They'd seen their co-workers get laid off from stable tech jobs. They'd learned that California's housing market wasn't a safe investment. It was a trap. So even as prices fell, they didn't come back. They stayed renters. They moved to other states. They gave up on the dream entirely. And without buyers, prices kept falling. The cracks weren't just forming anymore. They were spreading. Deep fractures running through the entire structure of California's housing market. But most people still believed it would stabilize, that the government would step in, that somehow, some way, the market would find a floor and bounce back. They were wrong, because level 5 wasn't correction. It was a collapse, and it was already beginning. What came next changed everything, not just for homeowners, but for entire cities. And once it started, there was no stopping it. Level 5, the collapse accelerates. The panic was no longer quiet. It started with a headline that sent shockwaves through every California homeowner's phone. Major California bank tightens lending standards. Mortgages over $1 million now require 30% down. Then another. Tech layoffs hit 50,000 in Bay Area, highest since .com crash. Then another. California sees largest population decline in state history. The narrative had flipped. California wasn't the Golden State anymore. It was the state people were fleeing. And the housing market went into free fall. Panic selling erupted. Homeowners who'd been holding out, hoping prices would recover, suddenly realized this isn't a dip. This is a spiral. And if they didn't sell now, they might not be able to sell at all. Listings exploded. In Los Angeles County alone, inventory jumped 180% in 6 months. In the Bay Area, homes that had been off-market for years suddenly appeared on Zillow with desperate price cuts. A 4-bedroom in San Jose that sold for $1.8 million in 2021 was now listed at $1.2 million. No offers. The owner dropped it to $1.05 million. Still nothing. 2 months later, it sold for $920,000, a loss of nearly $900,000 from peak. The math was brutal. The psychology was worse. Because selling at a massive loss is one thing. Selling and still owing the bank money? That's a nightmare. Remember Sarah and Marcus from Oakland? They bought at $850,000. Their home was now worth $680,000. They owed $780,000 on their mortgage. If they sold, they had to bring $100,000 cash to closing just to escape. They didn't have $100,000. So they did what tens of thousands of California families were doing. They stopped paying. Foreclosures surged. Not the trickle from level 4. A flood. In Stockton, 1 in every 47 homes entered foreclosure proceedings. In Modesto, 1 in 39. Banks were seizing properties faster than they could auction them off. The for sale signs multiplied into forests. Entire neighborhoods looked abandoned. Lawns turned brown. Pools filled with algae. Security systems blinked red on empty houses. Investors, the ones who propped up the market during the early decline, were now fleeing too. BlackRock and other institutional landlords started quietly dumping properties. They'd bought at peak prices. And even with rent income, the numbers no longer worked. Property values had fallen so far that their rental yields couldn't justify holding. They sold, in bulk, at steep discounts. A portfolio of 30 homes in Riverside sold for 40% below what the investor had paid 3 years earlier. Another portfolio in Sacramento went for 35% below purchase price. And when the smart money runs, everyone else panics. Construction didn't just slow, it died. Cranes that had dotted the skylines of San Francisco and Los Angeles disappeared. Half-built towers sat frozen, draped in weathered construction netting like concrete tombstones. Developers walked away from projects entirely. Why finish a condo building when units that cost $600,000 to build would now sell for $400,000? Why pour more money into a losing bet? Tens of thousands of construction workers lost their jobs. Subcontractors went bankrupt. Architectural firms closed. The entire industry collapsed in on itself. The ripple effect spread like poison to the economy. Real estate agents, Once California's most optimistic salespeople, were leaving in droves. The ones who stayed were desperate, slashing commissions to 1%, sometimes less, just to close a deal. Any deal. Mortgage brokers shuttered their offices. Title companies operated skeleton crews. Home inspectors found other work. But the worst part? The businesses that had nothing to do with housing started failing too. Restaurants closed because their customer base had moved to Texas. Retailers shut down because foot traffic had vanished. Even dentists and pediatricians found themselves struggling as young families. The ones who'd been the economic engine of suburban California simply weren't there anymore. City budgets started hemorrhaging. Property taxes are the lifeblood of California municipalities. When home values crater, tax revenues crater too, and cities had budgeted based on peak valuations. Sacramento projected a $200 million budget shortfall. Stockton cut public services by 25%. Smaller cities started furloughing police officers, firefighters, teachers. Parks went unmaintained. Streetlights stayed dark. Potholes went unfilled. The decline was feeding itself now. People were leaving because the cities were deteriorating. The cities were deteriorating because people were leaving. A death spiral. And through it all, a strange quiet settled over California's suburbs. Not the peaceful quiet of a Sunday morning. The eerie quiet of abandonment. Drive through subdivisions that once teemed with life, and you'd see it. Empty driveways. Dark windows. For sale signs fading in the sun. The collapse wasn't theoretical anymore. It wasn't something happening to other people in other neighborhoods. It was everywhere. It was undeniable. It was accelerating. And the people still holding on, the ones who couldn't sell, who couldn't leave, who were trapped by underwater mortgages and evaporating equity, they were beginning to realize something terrifying. This wasn't going to stop at level 5. There were still 2 levels left, and they were darker than anyone wanted to imagine. What happens when an entire region doesn't just decline, but empties out? When the dream doesn't just fade, but dies completely? The answer is level 6. And it's already happening in places most Americans have never heard of. Level 6, the ghost towns. By mid-2025, parts of California had become unrecognizable. The Central Valley, once California's fastest-growing region, was now its most haunted. Drive through cities like Manteca, Lathrop, or Mountain House, and you'd see neighborhoods that looked like movie sets for post-apocalyptic films. Entire subdivisions built in the 2010s boom, now sitting vacant. Rows of houses with boarded windows. Streets with no cars. Cul-de-sacs where the only sound was wind rattling chain-link fences. These weren't temporary vacancies. These were ghost towns. The families who'd lived here, the ones who commuted 2 hours each way to San Francisco or San Jose, were gone. Their remote jobs had been eliminated in the tech layoffs. Their equity had vanished. Their ability to sell had disappeared. So they'd walked away, handed the keys to the bank, and moved to Phoenix, Austin, Nashville, places where a fresh start was possible and a 2-bedroom apartment didn't cost $3,000 a month. The banks foreclosed, then tried to sell. But who was buying homes in cities where half the population had left? No one. So the houses sat and decayed. Windows shattered from neglect. Pipes burst from frozen winters. Squatters moved in, then moved out. Copper wiring was stripped and sold for scrap. Graffiti spread across walls like ivy. What had been worth $500,000 in 2021 was now worth $150,000, if you could even find a buyer. But the ghost towns weren't limited to the Central Valley. Parts of the Inland Empire looked similarly abandoned. Neighborhoods in San Bernardino, Riverside, Hemet, they'd followed the same trajectory. Boom, overbuilding, collapse, exodus. Even the Bay Area, pockets of devastation appeared. East Oakland, already struggling before the collapse, saw entire blocks of homes foreclosed and left empty. In San Francisco, the downtown core, once the beating heart of West Coast finance and tech, was a shell. Office towers stood dark. Ground floor retail spaces were papered over. Homeless encampments expanded into plazas that used to host food trucks and office workers on lunch breaks. The city had been built for 900,000 people. By 2025, the population had dropped below 750,000 and falling. San Francisco wasn't dying dramatically. It was dying quietly, block by block, storefront by storefront. The contrast was devastating. There were photo archives from 2019, vibrant, alive, the Ferry building packed with tourists, Valencia Street lined with boutique shops and cafes, Soma filled with startups and innovation. Now, the Ferry building echoed. Valencia Street had more vacant storefronts than operating ones. Soma's office spaces were being converted into whatever might generate revenue. Storage units, indoor parking, anything. But perhaps the most haunting stories came from the families themselves. Meet the Johnsons. They'd bought their dream home in Tracy in 2020. A 4-bedroom with a backyard, good schools nearby, a 2-hour commute to the tech job that made it all possible. By 2024, David Johnson had been laid off. They couldn't sell. The house was worth $300,000 less than they owed. They drained their savings just staying afloat. In early 2025, they made the decision. They packed what fit in their SUV, left furniture behind, left the keys on the kitchen counter, and drove to Tennessee. We didn't want to leave, David said in an interview later. That house was supposed to be where we raised our kids, where we built our life. But California didn't want us anymore. Or maybe we couldn't afford to want it. The Johnsons were one family. There were hundreds of thousands just like them. The U.S. Census data confirmed it. California lost 1.2 million residents between 2022 and 2025, the largest population decline of any state in American history. And the people leaving weren't retirees downsizing in Arizona. They were young families, working professionals, the tax base, the economic engine, the future. What they left behind were ghosts. Ghost towns in the Central Valley, ghost neighborhoods in the suburbs, ghost office towers in the cities. California had become a state of two worlds. One world, the ultra-wealthy enclaves, Malibu, Atherton, Newport Beach, places where the rich were insulated, where $10 million estates held their value because scarcity and prestige still mattered. The other world, everyone else, the middle class that had been hollowed out, the working families that had been priced out, then forced out, then forgotten. Municipal services collapsed under the strain. Schools closed by the dozens. Fire stations operated with half their normal staff. Police response times doubled, then tripled. Libraries shut their doors. In Stockton, the city filed for bankruptcy protection for the second time in 15 years. In San Bernardino, city workers went unpaid for weeks while the government scrambled to find cash. The California dream, the promise that hard work and determination could build a good life, was dead, and the people who believed in it most were the ones mourning in the ruins. But there was still one level left, the darkest level, the one where even hope becomes a luxury no one could afford. Level 7 isn't just about empty houses or shuttered businesses. It's about what happens when the collapse becomes permanent, when there's no bottom, no bounce back, no recovery in sight. Level 7, the aftermath, late 2025. The collapse was complete. California's median home price, which had peaked at $830,000 in 2022, now sat at $410,000, a 50% decline. The kind of crash economists said was impossible in modern America, but it had happened, and the aftermath was unlike anything the state had ever experienced. Banks stopped lending, not just tightened standards. Stopped? Why issue a mortgage in a market that had lost half its value in 3 years and showed no signs of stabilizing? The risk was too great. Cash buyers were the only buyers, and there were almost none. Cities faced existential budget crises. With property tax revenues decimated, municipalities couldn't provide basic services. Some contemplated dissolving entirely, merging with counties just to survive. The state government, once flush with budget surpluses from tech boom tax revenues, was now projecting a $60 billion deficit. Programs were slashed. Public universities raised tuition 40%. Infrastructure projects were abandoned mid-construction. And the The ones who'd stayed? They were trapped in a California that no longer functioned like it used to. If you own a home outright or had bought decades ago, you could survive. But if you bought between 2019 and 2022, you were underwater, locked into a property you couldn't sell, watching your net worth bleed out month after month. The psychological toll was immense. Depression, anxiety, families torn apart by financial stress. A generation that had bet everything on California real estate and lost. But here's what made Level 7 different from 2008. There was no cavalry coming. In 2008, the federal government bailed out the banks. Interest rates dropped to zero. Stimulus flooded the economy. The recovery, slow as it was, eventually came. This time, the political didn't exist. The federal deficit was too large. Interest rates couldn't drop. They were fighting inflation. And California had become a cautionary tale, not a victim-deserving rescue. They overbuilt. They overspeculated. They created this mess themselves. That was the narrative. True or not, it meant California was on its own. Some economists started using a new term, structural collapse. Not a cyclical downer that would eventually reverse, but a fundamental reshaping of California's economy and population. The state that had once been America's future was now its cautionary past. And yet, within the ruins, something unexpected was stirring. Artists and activists moved into vacant buildings. Community gardens sprouted in abandoned lots. Younger generations, priced out for so long, finally found affordable rent and started reimagining what California could be. Not the California of tech billionaires and McMansions, but a California of resilience, of adaptation, of building something new from the rubble. It was too early to call a renaissance, too fragile to call a hope, but it was something, because the truth about collapses is this: they're never truly the end. They're resets, painful, brutal, unavoidable resets. The California dream of 2020, the one built on speculation and unsustainable growth, was dead. There was no bringing it back. But maybe, just maybe, a different dream could emerge. Smaller, humbler, more grounded in reality than fantasy. That was Level 7. Not an ending, a reckoning. That 3-bedroom house in California, the one that symbolized success, it didn't die overnight. It died in stages. 7 stages. From the golden dream to the overheating. From the warning signs to the cracks. From the collapse to the ghost towns, and finally to the aftermath. Some cities are still at Level 2, riding high, convinced it won't happen to them. Others have reached Level 6, already hollowed out and abandoned. And a few, just a few, have crossed into Level 7, where the old world is gone and something new, uncertain, is trying to be born. So here's my question for you. Which level is your city on? Drop a comment. Tell me what you're seeing in your neighborhood, the signs, the stories, the reality behind the headlines. Because this isn't just California's story. Housing markets across America are watching, learning, and maybe, if we're honest about what happened here, other states won't have to learn these lessons the hard way. If you want to know which state we think is heading toward collapse next, make sure you're subscribed. We're tracking the warning signs. And trust me, they're already appearing. Thanks for watching. And remember, the best time to recognize a collapse is before it's too late.